fires everywhere. It makes my pandemic binge watch shortlist. It's just 8 episodes long, set in Shaker Heights, suburban Cleveland in the 1990s. And Little Fires Everywhere takes us through this complex and intertwining set of relationships between 2 women and 2 households. And by examining those through the lenses of race and class, ask the question of what does it mean to be a mother or to be a leader of a household? Mia Warren, she's an artist, a single mother, played by Kerry Washington, scraping together her existence. She rents from a woman named Elena Richardson, who's played by Reese Witherspoon. And Elena leads, from, by all appearances, the perfect suburban life. But appearances being deceptive, that life literally goes up in flames by the end of the series. In the 4th episode, these 2 characters have a heated discussion in Elena's living room. And Elena charges at Mia, "A good mother makes good choices." And Mia retorts, "You didn't make good choices, you had good choices. You didn't make good choices, you had good choices." Having good choices is one of the working assumptions of today's first reading. A capable wife who can find. She is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all her household are clothed in crimson. It's great not to fear the weather, but that takes a certain amount of resource, especially in the ancient Near East. So as context, wisdom literature, and especially this book of Proverbs, was compiled from really a breadth of Near Eastern traditions by scribes. And these scribes were literate men in the courts of the local area, so they functioned kind of as bureaucrats and also diplomats. This portion from tonight actually came from the household of a king. So it was the scribes' purview, but also in their best interest, to have a well-ordered society, one that functions according to a very practical wisdom. Suffices to say, then, that this wisdom was not crowdsourced, and it was not distinct to ancient Israel. It's a genre of writing, though, that later appears in Christian texts, and I think especially in portions of the epistles that we call the household codes. They don't figure heavily into our lectionary or our 3-year cycle of readings, but they do treat things like how people, mostly women, are to dress, when they are to speak, what their hair is to look like. And I think we can read those broadly in saying that a well-ordered society is part of what keeps a minority in check and allows for religious and cultural life to continue with minimal incident, and that's part of the function that this scriptural wisdom served. Enter Jesus. Jesus is a little bit less concerned with preserving the status quo than his Hebrew forebears or his Christian successors. So we find ourselves here in Mark's gospel. Just to set the stage, so Jesus has just been transfigured on a mountaintop. He's been revealed to be God's beloved child. And he sets his sights towards Jerusalem, where we heard on the mountaintop, as we heard today, he will be betrayed, arrested, tortured, and killed. This is not exactly a picture of social order. So as Jesus comes down with the mountain with his disciples, there are immediately in succession 3 stories that involve children. That first story happens. Jesus' disciples go, and there's a child who's, probably epileptic, throwing themselves to the ground, and they say, "This one has a demon." And the disciples couldn't cure the child. Only Jesus could do that, and only Jesus by prayer. It was an extreme case. Then we get to tonight's lesson. Jesus puts the disciples and all of their ladder climbing in check by centering a nameless, and in our text, this child does not have a he, she, or they pronoun. This child has an it pronoun. Centers this nameless and otherwise totally nondescript being. And then in a third mention, which is just a few verses later, Jesus charges his disciples and he says, "If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you to have a great millstone around your neck and have you thrown into the sea." It's by repetition, by bringing into the center these children who have very few choices, that Jesus is upending a religious system that prioritizes those who can choose over those who cannot. And he says to his disciples, as he says to us, that whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Now, I imagine many of us know what it's like not to be first. Like we've all been there. I suspect that most of us don't know what it's like to be dead last, like last of all. Just over a week ago, the New York Times published a rather alarming article entitled, "What's Going On with Our Black Girls?" The article examined the rising suicide rates among Black youth, both boys and girls, in the context of other national trends around youth suicide. In the years that the article studied, which were 2003 to 2017, the suicide rate for Black girls increased by an average of 6.6% per year. That was before the summer of racial reckoning, before the pandemic that disproportionately affected Black families in its health and in education. Suicide remains the second leading cause of death among all adolescents. And we can safely assume, even without the next 3 years' data sets, that it hasn't gotten any better for Black girls. In the past years, we've gotten really good at recognizing the symptoms that might be associated with COVID. We probably all know how to get tested or to help somebody else get tested if they don't know how. September is Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month, and my hope is that each of us in this community will, in the course of these next weeks, become as familiar with the warning signs of suicide as we are with the symptoms of COVID. And that in addition to knowing the warning signs, that we will know how to point somebody to resources if they need help, including if that someone is ourself. An excellent place to start is visiting the website of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI. And the website is nami.org, NAMI.org. There on that website, they have warning signs and risk factors, as well as the sorts of suicidal behaviors that cue us that this is an actual emergency. Things like saving pills, buying weapons, giving away possessions, tying up loose ends, saying goodbye to friends and family. And in those extreme circumstances, it's just really appropriate to call 911. That's the best way to ask for help. But much of the time when we encounter people, they're not in that place with that kind of immediate plan. And in that case, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline would be an excellent resource. In particular, if you work with adolescents or adolescents of color, I hope that you will help yourself and your colleagues to learn the risk and warning signs and to provide that needed help for children and youth who are very much on the periphery of our society. We all are on a journey with Jesus, who has set his face toward Jerusalem. And on the way, the disciples, and sometimes us, we're trying to best one another. But then Jesus comes in and he centers an utterly defenseless child, and he takes that child into his arms. We choose to follow Jesus, to take that most fragile life into our hands and into our hearts, not simply to make better choices, but to ensure that all people have better choices.